Rangers and hunters, what's the scariest thing you've encountered in the forest? I was 17 and deer hunting with my older brother on public land in rural Pennsylvania. It was our third year hunting that particular area, a big block of state forest that butted up against some private farmland. We knew it reasonably well. On the second morning of the season, I was posted at the base of a big oak in a narrow hollow while my brother worked the ridge above. It was cold and still, and I had been sitting there since before first light. Around 8 in the morning, I heard something moving through the leaves to my left, downhill toward the creek. It sounded like a deer at first, but the footfalls were irregular. I turned slowly and looked, and there was a man crawling through the woods. Not crouched or ducking, actually crawling on his hands and knees through the dead leaves, moving slowly and steadily along the creek bank. He was wearing street clothes, jeans and a dark jacket. No blaze orange, no hunting gear. I was so confused that I just sat there and watched him for a minute before I said, "Hey." He stopped. He turned his head and looked at me over his shoulder. His face was completely blank. No surprise, no embarrassment, no acknowledgement that there was anything unusual about what he was doing. He just looked at me for several seconds and then turned his head back and kept crawling until he was out of sight around a bend in the creek. I called my brother on the radio immediately. We left together and reported it to the Game Commission office on the way out. The officer we spoke to wrote it down and then asked us which part of the forest we had been in. When we told him, he nodded slowly and said they'd had other calls from that area before. He didn't say what kind of calls. I did 3 years in the army, and after I got out, I spent a lot of time hiking and camping alone in the wilderness areas of the Pacific Northwest. It was good for me. The quiet and the physical effort and the solitude did things for my head that nothing else was doing at the time. I became very comfortable alone in remote places, and I got to know the difference between normal discomfort and actual warning signals pretty well. In the summer of 2019, I was on a week-long solo trip in the Pasayten Wilderness in northern Washington, right up near the Canadian border. On my third night, I was camped in a high meadow at about 6,000 feet. Clear night, bright stars, no wind. I woke up with an absolute certainty that I needed to get out of my tent. Not a thought exactly, more like a physical directive, the same feeling you get when your body wakes you up because something is wrong before your brain catches up. I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the meadow. The night was perfectly still. I stood there in the dark for a minute, feeling like an idiot, and then looked up toward the tree line at the upper edge of the meadow. There was a row of figures standing at the edge of the trees. I could see them against the lighter darkness of the open meadow beyond. 6 or 7 of them, tall and still, evenly spaced along the tree line. I stood and looked at them, and they stood and looked at me for what felt like several minutes before I stepped back into my tent. I sat inside with my knife in my hand until it got light. In the morning, the tree line was empty. I found nothing at the edge of the trees when I checked. The grass was undisturbed. Whatever had been standing there in the dark had been standing there very carefully. I was 19 when I got a summer job doing vegetation surveys for a forestry company in northern British Columbia. Basically, you hike transects through remote forest, record what plant species you find, and mark GPS points. Straightforward work, but you're often several kilometers from the nearest road and completely alone. I was fine with that. I grew up camping and hiking, and I wasn't the type to spook easily. About 6 weeks into the job, I was running a transect through an area of old-growth timber that the company was evaluating. Dense forest, limited visibility, the kind of place where the light barely reaches the ground. I was about 3 kilometers in when I found the first one. A rabbit hanging from a low branch by a length of twine. Recently dead, arranged neatly, deliberately. I marked the GPS point and kept moving, uncomfortable but not panicking. 100 meters further, I found another one. Same thing, same height, same careful arrangement. Then another, then another. Over the next 400 meters of transect, I counted 11 of them. All rabbits, all hung at exactly the same height, all perfectly spaced. Whatever this was, someone had put real time into it. I called my supervisor on the satellite phone and described what I was seeing. There was a long pause before he told me to walk directly back to the road and wait for him there. He didn't ask questions. He didn't tell me not to worry. He just said, "Get out now." I've always wondered what he already knew about that area that made him respond that way. 3 years ago, my search and rescue team was called out to look for a missing hiker in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington. Male, mid-40s, experienced, had gone out for a day hike and didn't come back. We searched for 2 full days before we found him. He was physically fine, dehydrated and shaken but uninjured. He had been less than a mile from the trailhead the entire time, in an area that should have been impossible to get lost in. When we brought him out and the medics cleared him, I sat with him while we waited for his family and asked him what had happened. He was quiet for a long time before he said that he had been following the trail when he heard a child crying in the trees. He left the trail to look for the child and within minutes had no idea which direction the trail was. He described wandering in what felt like circles for hours, even though the terrain should have made that impossible. He said the crying kept moving. Every time he got close to where he thought it was coming from, it would shift direction. He followed it for hours, until dark, and then just sat down against a tree and didn't move until morning. He said the crying stopped exactly when the sun came down. I've talked to 2 other SAR volunteers who have heard similar accounts from lost hikers in that forest. A child's voice that moves through the trees and pulls people off the trail. Nobody has an explanation for it. I grew up on the eastern edge of the Olympic Peninsula in Washington, right where the mountains meet the lowlands. My dad was a logger, and his dad before him, and I spent my entire childhood in and around some of the densest old-growth forest left in the lower 48. By the time I was in high school, I had forgotten more about those woods than most people ever learn. I hunted elk and deer and spent weeks at a stretch in the backcountry without anything unusual ever happening. When I was 22, I was hunting elk solo on the upper slopes of a drainage I had been into several times before. It was early October and the bulls were still active. Good conditions. I was moving slowly along a game trail in the late afternoon when I came across a tree. I know how that sounds, but let me explain. It was a big old Douglas fir, maybe 4 feet in diameter, and someone or something had stripped the bark from its entire lower trunk, up to about 12 feet, and covered the exposed wood with handprints. Dozens of them, dark reddish-brown and pressed flat against the pale wood in every direction. They were large, larger than my hands by a significant margin, and I have big hands. Some of them were smeared like whatever made them had dragged its palm across the surface after pressing it down. I stood in front of that tree for a long time. The forest was very quiet. I took a photograph and got out of that drainage before dark. I showed the photo to a man in town who had grown up in those same mountains and was in his 70s. He looked at it for a long time and then handed my phone back and told me to stay out of that drainage. I asked him why. He said because whatever leaves those marks knows the difference between people who have seen them and people who haven't. I didn't go back. I still don't know what he meant, and I'm not sure I want to. My family has owned land in the hill country of central Texas for 4 generations. About 600 acres of cedar and live oak and dry creek beds that my great-grandfather homesteaded in the 1890s. I grew up on that land, and I know every corner of it. When I was in my mid-30s, I started finding things on the back portion of the property that I couldn't account for. It started with a deer carcass that had been arranged in a way that no predator arranges a kill. The bones were sorted and placed in a pattern. I assumed some kids had done it and didn't think much more about it. Then a few months later, I found a circle of stones in a dry creek bed, about 12 feet across, with the interior swept clean of any debris. This was far enough back on the property that you would have to know the land to find it. The stones were heavy enough that moving them would have taken real effort. I set up a game camera nearby and left it for 2 weeks. When I pulled the card, I scrolled through hundreds of images of deer and hogs and raccoons going about their business at night. Then, at 2:47 on a Thursday morning, there was a single frame of a figure standing just outside the camera's range, barely visible at the edge of the frame. Upright and tall and completely still, with its face turned toward the camera. I showed it to my neighbor who has lived in the area his whole life. He looked at it for a long time and then handed my phone back and told me to move the camera. He wouldn't say anything else about it, and he left shortly after. I moved the camera. I haven't checked the back of that property alone. I'm a trapper, and I've run trap lines in rural northern Minnesota for most of my adult life. I'm out in the field before first light most mornings from November through March, and I cover a lot of ground alone, in the dark in conditions that would keep most people indoors. I tell you this so you understand that I am not easily spooked, and I am not prone to letting my imagination run away from me. What I'm about to describe happened 3 winters ago, and I have not been able to find a satisfactory explanation for it. I was checking a line along a creek bottom about 4 miles from the nearest road. It was a clear morning, maybe 10 below, with a hard crust of snow that made every footstep loud. I came around a bend in the creek and found my trap had been sprung. This happens, nothing unusual about it, but the trap had been placed and sprung, and something had pulled the drag and moved the whole set about 20 feet before leaving it. I followed the drag marks, and they led me to a hole in the creek bank. A large depression dug into the frozen bank above the waterline. I crouched down and looked at it with my headlamp. Something had excavated a cavity in the frozen ground large enough for a person to sit inside. The claw marks in the frozen dirt were large, much larger than a bare paw, and they were on the inside of the hole. Like whatever made them had been sitting in there and trying to pull the edges of the opening closed from within. I stood up and looked around the creek bottom in every direction and felt the skin tighten across the back of my neck in a way it hasn't in a long time. I pulled the rest of that line, and I haven't run traps in that creek bottom since. I'm a hunting guide in the Ozarks. Have been for going on 18 years. I've taken hundreds of clients into those hills, and I've seen just about everything that forest has to offer. Timber rattlers, black bears, feral hog encounters that got out of hand fast, the works. I've pulled lost hunters out of situations that should have killed them. I've found things in those woods I won't describe in detail. But the thing that changed me happened on a solo scouting trip about 6 years ago. No clients, just me moving through an area I was considering for turkey season. It was late afternoon, and I was making my way along a dry creek bed when I came across a deer. A big doe, standing about 30 yards ahead of me in the creek bed. She was alive, but she wasn't moving right. Her head was hanging low, and her front legs were positioned wrong, turned out at an angle that legs don't naturally go. She was swaying slightly. I've seen deer with chronic wasting disease, and this didn't look like that. I stood there, watching her, and after a minute she turned and looked directly at me. Her eyes were wrong. Not sick wrong, just wrong. Like whatever was supposed to be behind them wasn't there anymore. She held eye contact with me for a long time, and then opened her mouth. No sound came out, but she held it open for several seconds before closing it again. Then she turned and walked into the brush and was gone. I've described that moment to other guides and hunters, and the ones who spend real time in deep woods always get quiet when I finish. A few of them have nodded slowly, like they know exactly what I'm talking about. None of them have ever said what they think it was. This happened in the fall of 2016. I was elk hunting solo in a remote part of the Flathead National Forest in Montana. I had packed in about 9 miles on horseback and set up a spike camp near a high alpine basin. Beautiful country, the kind of place that makes you feel genuinely lucky to be alive. I was there for 5 days, and the first 3 were uneventful. On the 4th night, I woke up at some point in the early hours to my horses making noise. They were tied at a picket line about 30 yards from my tent, and they were moving around and pulling against their lead ropes in a way that suggested they were scared. I lay there listening and trying to figure out what was spooking them. Could have been a bear or a lion in the area. I grabbed my rifle and unzipped the tent and sat at the entrance listening. The horses were upset, but I couldn't hear or see anything in the darkness that would explain it. Then I heard something from the tree line above camp. A sound that I have genuinely struggled to describe to people ever since. The closest I can get is that it sounded like a very large animal attempting to mimic a human voice. Not words exactly, but rhythm and cadence and tone that were structured the way speech is structured without being any language I recognized. It lasted maybe 30 seconds and then stopped, and the forest went completely quiet. The horses settled within a few minutes. In the morning, there was nothing in the tree line to explain what I had heard. I've been hunting elk for 20 years, and I've never heard any animal, any weather, any combination of natural sounds that comes close to explaining what came out of those trees that night. I spent 4 years working as a wildlife biologist in the Tongass National Forest in southeast Alaska. The Tongass is the largest national forest in the country, and there are sections of it that have almost certainly never had a human set foot in them. I worked alone more often than not, doing species surveys deep in the interior, sometimes camping for a week at a stretch without any contact with another person. I was comfortable out there, more comfortable than most people would ever be, which is why I want to be clear that what happened in my 3rd year wasn't something I can chalk up to an experience or nerves. I was camped near a salmon stream in late August, brown bear country, and I had my protocols down cold. Bear canister, clean camp, no food smells anywhere near my tent. I woke up at around 3 in the morning to complete silence. If you've spent time in that forest, you know it's never completely silent. There's always something. Rain or wind or the creek or animals moving through. This was a silence that felt applied, like something heavy had been set down over the forest. I lay still and listened for a long time before I heard breathing outside my tent. Slow and deep and very close to the wall of the tent near my head. Too slow and too measured for a bear. Bears are loud and snuffly, and they move constantly. This was still, just that slow, deliberate breathing an inch from my ear with only a thin layer of nylon between us. I didn't move for a very long time. Eventually it stopped, and I heard slow footsteps move away through the undergrowth. Bipedal footsteps. In the morning, there was nothing outside my tent. No tracks, no disturbance in the moss. Just the stream and the birds starting up again like nothing had happened. I finished my survey, and I've never gone back to that drainage. Some of my colleagues think I'm being irrational. I let them think that.